I would like to welcome everyone to Scott's Eye, Ask a Scientist. We've got Ian Molnar with us tonight to talk to us about microplastics, and his new research in microplastics. I wanted to just introduce myself first. I'm Maureen Whalen. I'm one of the Scott's Eye committee members, and Scott's Eye is a volunteer science communication organization, and we work really hard to bring new and exciting and interesting science and scientists to our audiences. And as I said before, we have Ian Molnar with us tonight to talk to us about microplastics. Ian is a lecturer in hydrogeology at the University of Edinburgh and Geosciences, and is focusing now on the contaminants in groundwater and the fate and transport of those contaminants, in particular microplastics in groundwater. And that's a huge issue that's becoming more and more of concern, I think. And I'd like to send it over to Ian, and you can start giving us a few words about what you're doing, and then we can just open it right up to the chat for questions. I should also say, so put questions in the chat if you like, or if you're interested in asking questions verbally, you can just I think you just raise your hand, and then we can unmute you. If you would please keep your video off, just to make things tidy. And we are recording, and hopefully that's recording message came through and you're all okay with that. And here we go with Ian. Thank you.
Hello. All right. Yeah, so I'm trying to get a microplastic research program off the ground. It turns out no one makes money off of cleaning up microplastics, so it's hard to get research funding for that, unfortunately. But it's the direction I'm trying really hard to go in, and I was going to talk a little bit about that today. Yeah, and then open it up for questions. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Oh, host disabled, participant screen sharing. The question is,
sorry, give me a second.
This could be a very short PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, that's right. I have to see how I make you.
Yes.
How I can get you to share your screen. Make host, make co-host, perhaps. Hey, Lloyd, in the background, do you think?
Yeah, for host. Yeah, host.
I have to admit, I've used so many different software platforms for presentations over the last 2 years. I've lost track of where all the different buttons are between Teams and the one the University of Edinburgh uses, and Zoom, and there's the odd person still holding on to Skype.
No, I know, right? It's crazy, right? Who would believe it? So I just need to make you co-host, right?
Yeah, I believe that's what's needed.
Try the co-host bit. Okay. That worked.
All right. Ooh, there we go. I think this works. Okay, so I threw this together this afternoon, so hopefully there's not too many typos or anything in it. Slideshow, current slide. Okay, so just a little bit about me to provide some context. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from Scotland. So while I'm currently a lecturer in hydrogeology at the School of Geosciences here at the University of Edinburgh, I'm originally from, so this is going to get kind of funny, because you realize that, I mean, I like to joke that Scotland and the UK ripped off all of the names of places in Canada. So I'm from a town right about there called Iona Station. And so to put that in context, that's about the same latitude as Northern Italy. So any Canadian who goes on about we the North or anything like that doesn't really know what they're talking about. So I'm an engineer by training. So I did my bachelor's and master's and PhD at the University of Western Ontario in London. Yes, we have our own London. It has its own little Thames River running through it. It's not as nice as actual London. So I'm a civil engineer by training, and then I went off to York University in Toronto to do a postdoc over there. And then then I've been here since about 2000, halfway through 2019. I've been living in Edinburgh, right downtown in Newington. So if you hear sirens behind me, that's just the traffic right outside my door. So I've worked on a whole bunch of different topics over the years. So my main focus is basically how stuff, I'm gonna loosely call it, a very scientific term, stuff, moves through groundwater, and then how do you get it out of groundwater once the stuff is in there? So I've done a lot of work on particles in surface and groundwater. So that's actually what my PhD was on, looking at how nanotechnology and bacteria and viruses and all of that gets into our groundwater, and basically, how does it move through that groundwater? Can it travel far enough to get to our drinking water wells? And I'm trying to get some funding to basically extend that out to look at microplastics, because microplastics are getting into our groundwater. We found them in our aquifers, and I want to know if they're ending up in our drinking water. I've also done a bit of work on industrial contaminants, so things like solvents, and also looking at doing some work on the remediation technologies needed to clean up solvents once they get into soil and groundwater. And lately, basically since moving here to the UK, because there's a lot of work here in the UK on carbon neutral technologies and geoenergy, I've been doing a lot of work on that here. So looking at things like the science behind nuclear waste repositories, how can we make them safer? How can we make them more environmentally friendly and sustainable? And I currently also have some students doing work on carbon capture and storage, and looking at whether or not we can store hydrogen gas underground. Because I think hydrogen's one of the big buzzwords right now for carbon neutral technologies. So a whole broad range of things, but it all boils down to how does stuff get into groundwater and how does it behave? Interestingly enough, the physics of how one thing moves through the ground is identical to how the physics of another thing moves through anything. So if it's a fluid, a porous medium, and then anything in that porous medium, the physics is identical, right? So the physics of how bacteria moves through our soil, or microplastics move through soil, is identical to how those N95 masks, for instance, filter out viruses. And so it's kind of fun once you figure out one topic of science, you can kind of move around between all of them. And so I get distracted by a lot of different topics. So I've worked on different things. So I've been doing some work on microplastics in UK waters, trying to build up, start slowly building up a database of basically where are microplastics in UK. This is all focused on surface water so far. That's me. So that's my email address is there. If you ever have any questions, or if I have a question that I can't answer, which is probably going to be pretty likely, I'll look it up and I'll try to contact you via email or vice versa. But as always, the work is, so if an academic's showing something, the academic never does the work. It's always based on the students. And so I've had 3 fantastic students doing some microplastic work for me over the past couple of years: Katie, James, and Daphne. And what I'm going to be showing is a lot of the work from them. So some of this is going to get kind of depressing, but it'll hopefully end on a point of optimism. But so the idea is, so has everyone heard about, I guess, you've all seen microplastics in the news over the last couple of years, I'm guessing.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, so feel free to unmute yourself and shout or put something in chat if, but yeah, so these are just kind of a selection of the sort of depressing microplastic headlines we've seen. Like, people are finding microplastics in lungs, during surgery. We found microplastics in placenta. These researchers have found microplastics in placentas. Devastatingly, someone did a study of German beer brands and found microplastics in every single German beer brand that they tested. We found it in blood, just found it in human feces. So they think there might be a link to irritable bowel disease. And we found even, like, we're not even safe from, with tea, those like really premium, like fancy looking silk tea bags. Well, that's actually made out of plastic. It turns out when you expose it to hot water, they start to shed off. Billions of these teeny tiny little particles can end up in our tea. So basically, it seems like everywhere we go, we're being exposed to microplastics, and they're finding it inside of us a lot, which is kind of concerning. So similarly, anywhere you look in the environment, we're finding, microplastics is hitting the news headlines as well, anywhere in the environment. So this is the one at the top is, so someone, I think, did try to estimate how many plastic particles were in San Francisco Bay, which isn't the cleanest bay to begin with in the world. And they think they're estimating, something on the order of trillions of microplastic particles, which is an insane amount of plastic contamination in that bay. So they found it in Antarctica. They found it in in seabirds, like in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I think that study was on the Lord Howe Island off the coast of Australia. So it's really, really remote. And so we've found microplastics on every environment in the planet. So it's kind of it is depressing. And so probably the most famous one I would say people have probably heard of are these sort of great garbage patches that they found in the Pacific Ocean, where just based on, microplastics usually tend to flow towards the ocean, and then just based on ocean currents, they tend to build up in either this sort of western garbage patch or this eastern garbage patch in the ocean. And people often describe them as like floating islands, or I think that's the common conception of what these are. But in reality, that's not the case. It's just, so that's an image of one taken from underwater looking up. That was in National Geographic. And so you can see that it's not dense enough to stand on, but it's still this sort of slimy floating patch of plastic gunk. All right. So I guess, so that's, hold on. We're trying to find a place to put everyone's faces here. So just to, I don't know if anyone can hear all the motorcycles revving their engines behind me. So just a brief introduction to plastics. So plastics were the first fully synthetic plastic was created in 1907. So they haven't actually been around for that long, like just a little over 100 years. And a little over 100 years, we managed to put it in every environment on the planet. And so it's this sort of fantastic sort of polymer structure of all these different branches and chains. And it's this structure that kind of gives it these really fantastic properties that's made it really useful for everything, right? So like we can, plastic is a fantastic material. It's because we're so used to it now, it's hard for us to put into context just how much of a revolution it was, because now we're only seeing the problematic side of things in these news articles, right? But if you think about it, it's this phenomenal material that we can make it either light or dense, we can make it stiff or flexible, strong or weak. We can make it durable, or I put biodegradable in quotes because plastic isn't really biodegradable. It just breaks down into smaller pieces of plastic. And so it's revolutionized everything from medical technology, right? Like ventilators wouldn't exist if we didn't have plastics, for instance. And that's one of the things that's gotten us through this pandemic. To everything to consumer technology. And so it's easy to demonize now that we know it's this massive environmental and potential human problem, right? But like, modern society wouldn't exist without it, nor would modern medicine. So one, I guess, maybe fun or depressing thing to do. So as a quick quiz, we can try to put this in the chat if you can. Look around whatever room you're in, and then how many objects have at least some plastic in them? Or on the flip side, how many objects don't have any plastic in them? Just, I don't know, take 30 seconds and see if you can sort out, how much plastic is actually in your room. And if you have a question during, as I'm talking through this, yeah, at least 10 on your desk alone. Thousands. You're in a in a vinyl library, yeah. Two plants that aren't plastic. There you go. So yeah, so looking around, so my computer is almost all plastic, right? I have a plastic camera body sitting over there. Mouse, I do a lot of programming, so I have a little rubber duck on my desk. And what about just me and the dog? Hopefully the dog doesn't have any plastic. And so what about the clothes? Does anyone know, or who's wearing polyester right now? Or any sort of athleisure textile or anything like that? Because like that's all plastic as well. So everything, almost everything we have in our houses, everything we wear is plastic. So it's everywhere because it's this phenomenal material that we can do things with. Yeah, it's actually hard to find all natural materials now, especially like even jeans, right? All those like stretchy jeans that you can buy from Gap and things like that. And so what are microplastics? So microplastics are any plastic particle with at least one dimension less than 5 millimeters. So some people like to have a really strict definition on what a microplastic is, but I don't think that's very helpful, having a really strict definition, because there's always exceptions to the rule. So basically anything that's less than 5-ish millimeters in size, I would say. And there's two main kinds of it. So there's ones we call primary microplastics, which are deliberately generated. Like we've made these plastics to be really small, right? So those cosmetic microbeads that you used to be able to find, in makeup and soaps and all of that. If you bought a soap, I think Dove used to sell soap for men that had like an exfoliant in it, and that was often plastic. You could probably get it in like toothpaste or anything like that at one point. And I think those have been banned because it turned out they were bad for the environment. And so nurdles are another big one. So nurdles are these like really tiny plastic pellets that we use for resin to make other plastic particles. And so you can find these nurdles all around. There's actually a charity in the UK that's dedicated to cleaning up plastic on beaches, and they're called Nurdle. So if you're interested in sort of, looking more into this as a charity, they're worthwhile looking into. The second, and probably the most common type of microplastic you'll find in the environment, are secondary microplastics. And these are produced by weathering. And so when I say weathering, I mean any sort of process that breaks a big piece of plastic down into a smaller piece of plastic. I don't know if you've ever left any sort of garden furniture out in the sun, for a couple of years, and then you found it's kind of, you go to sit on the chair and you fall down onto the ground because it's broken apart or anything like that. Like all of those particles will break down into smaller particles over time. Or when I put my, clothes in the wash, all those polyester fibers are going to come out over time, because as my t-shirts get more and more threadbare. And so those are secondary microplastic particles that we've generated. And so between these primary and secondary microplastic particles, there's a lot of people out there right now trying to figure out how many of them that we're actually ingesting. And so what I've seen in the literature is that we figure adult humans probably ingest around somewhere on the order of 100,000 plastic particles a year between the food, air, and water. And if you don't drink bottled water, like water that comes in plastic bottles, that number goes down by a fair amount. And I think if you only drink bottled water, that number I think triples. So I think it's something like 25,000 if you don't, and well over 100,000 or ish if you do. And so we're ingesting lots and lots of these every single year over every year. And obviously that's going to be a very rough ballpark number. And so these plastic particles can range. So some of these, so I tried to avoid sad photos, but this was a really good illustrative one. So some of these plastic particles, if they're 5 millimeters and you ingest a whole lot of 5 millimeter particles, obviously that's bad. That's bad for your gut. It can choke things. It can choke wildlife. But as we get to smaller and smaller plastic particles, so as these particles weather down and down and down until we get below 1 millimeter into this micron range. And so one micron is about a millionth of a meter. So once we start getting down to 10 microns in size, that's about the size of bacteria. And at that point in time, these really small particles are starting to be able to actually enter our cells, like get through cell walls, cell membranes. And as you get down into this almost nanoplastic range, where you're down into these sort of 1 billionth of a meter in size, which they will eventually get down to, you start getting these particles that can actually cross things like your blood-brain barrier and get into cells and that. So it's really important for us to try and understand sort of where these, basically how are microplastics getting into the environment? Where are they, and how are we being exposed to them? And so, I guess this graphic here has a couple of different ways of how you go about visualizing it. So you can either just see it. So the students I've sent into the field can often just find plastics without needing to use a microscope. Or if you're looking for nanoplastics, which is very difficult to do, it takes a lot of money to try and find nanoplastic particles that are really, really small. So the risk, so it's not just the plastic that we care about when we're ingesting it. So this is a photo of like a plastic Tupperware container I found online. I didn't want to show you my own because it looks even sadder than this one. So plastics have this habit of absorbing compounds. Any compound that they encounter in the environment, there's a good chance that it's going to absorb it and sort of bring it into the actual plastic material, right? So if you, let's say, for whatever reason, you decide to eat this plastic container, you're not just eating the plastic, you're eating all of the stuff from the tomato dish, right? You're eating your leftover sauce that's been kind of sucked into this container. And so the risk might not just be from the plastic, it can be from the chemical that's now absorbed into that plastic. So microplastics in the environment, might be accumulating things like pesticides and heavy metals and pharmaceuticals or anything like that's also in the environment. And so there's sort of a double whammy of risk there. That we're all a little concerned about right now. So I guess the big thing is, so how are these getting into the environment, right? So there's a couple of different ways. There's direct release, right? So like direct littering, people directly throwing their plastic bottles into the into the water or anything like that. Or I don't know, on our street, whenever the wind whips up, all the garbage bins whip open and there's like a garbage tornado that comes out of them. So like just direct release of plastics. I've seen seagulls carrying plastic cups on Princess Street here in Edinburgh. Tire wear and tear. So tire particles are a big one, right? So as your tires get bald over time, hopefully you'll replace your tires, every couple of years. Those, right? All of those, like, it's going bald because it's releasing tire particles into the environment. So similarly, cities tend to accumulate all of this plastic dust from tires and everything over time. So dust from cities, agricultural and fishing products like geotextiles that you might use in the field, fishing nets, all of that kind of thing, landfills that might be leaking. Wastewater treatment plants are often thought of as the biggest point source of plastic pollution. So all of the products that we put down our sink, right? Like every time I do laundry, my wife does laundry. So every time my wife does laundry, right, or every time I put a little bit of plastic or whatever down the sink that's coming off, it all ends up in these wastewater treatment plants. And so the wastewater treatment plants will remove about 90% of the plastic from the water. So about 10% of the plastic that goes down the sink still gets discharged into our rivers and oceans and lakes after it's done with treatment. But then the other 90% of plastics that get removed will often get like consolidated or accumulated in sort of this sludge or this sort of treated human poo, which then goes on to it goes on to basically farm fields as fertilizer. And it's actually a really valuable resource for our farmers here in the UK and around the world. And so we're putting, hundreds of thousands of tons of plastic particles onto soils in Europe every year. And I think so America is pretty similar. So yeah, I found numbers for Europe and America. I haven't found anything for Canada or UK specific. So these are all very ballpark estimates. But these are just some of the different ways that plastics is ending up into the environment. The other one is compost. So all of those compost, like if you've ever tried to compost those, like compostable, like coffee pods or whatever, they often still have a plastic ring around them. Like all of that will still end up in compost, which then goes on to farm fields as well. So the bit that I'm personally really interested in knowing is basically, is this getting into our drinking water? Which so far the good news suggests that our drinking water treatment systems are keeping them mostly out of our drinking water. Usually people can't actually detect them in the drinking water system. And then the one I also want to know is this getting into our groundwater? And that's what I'm hoping to try and convince people to pay me to look at. So the question here is, how do you actually go about finding plastic particles in the environment? It's surprisingly hard to do considering how many of them are actually everywhere. So first off, you go and actually collect your sediments or your water sample. Here we are not following best practices in this image because we are using a plastic cup or sampling bottle to take the sample. Usually you want to avoid any sort of plastic. But sometimes budgetary constraints in the weight of carrying glass bottles into the field carries its own risk. So then there's always a balance there with these studies. So then you collect the samples and then we do something called a density separation. So because plastic is neutrally buoyant, so it's about the same density as water, you mix in a whole bunch of salt. So in this case, this is more dense than ocean water. So all the sediment sinks to the bottom and all the plastics float to the top. So you do this sort of density separation. And this is, I think, one of the first times we tried it. So it was kind of a crude decanting that we were doing. We have a fancier setup now. And then you basically, you filter it. So this is so kind of in that funny little chemistry section. This isn't my lab. My lab's neater than this. Then you basically filter that solution, that decanted solution through that filter, and all the plastic particles end up on this little tiny glass filter that you can then look at in basically an electronic stereo microscope. And then you have to go through and do this sort of painstaking manual counting of every plastic particle that you find. And people are starting to get quicker at this, where we're starting to develop ways of automating this counting. But once again, those systems tend to be really expensive. So most of these counts that you'll see in all of these studies tend to be done manually, which I feel really bad for all the grad students that I have sent out into the field to make them count thousands of plastic particles. And so one of the challenges of doing this type of plastic analysis is how do you actually, how do you tell what's, with clothing fiber versus what's human hair? How do you figure out if it's plastic or not? And visual identification alone can often be really, really challenging. So this is from, I think, Katie's thesis, where she was pulling out some of her own human hair to look at it under a microscope, pulling out some of her clothing fibers, just to practice looking at the difference between the two. And if you can't tell, you often need to go to a more advanced sort of chemical analysis technique to figure out what the material is actually made out of. But hopefully, usually it's easy enough to tell. So Katie, so last summer, she was one of our fantastic geoenergy master's students. She basically did a general river water quality survey in the River North Est, just to the east of Edinburgh. And that's the river that turned orange once the groundwater level in the coal mine rebounded up to the surface, and then all the iron oxide came out and basically precipitated out into the riverbed. So she was going along, we were doing a water quality survey along there, and I had her collect some samples and test them for microplastics as well. And so she collected the microplastics, I think around samples numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or where she looked at sort of microplastics in the river sediment there. And one of the things she found, so taking a look at this, if you take a look at, so location 1 is the 1 on the map there, 2 is the 2 on the map. So as you're moving from 1 to higher numbers, you're moving downstream. So she found at well over 100 microplastic particles per 100 grams of river sediment in every single sample she looked at. So on one hand, right, you're really excited because you're looking for data and you found really good data. On the other hand, it's sad because it means everywhere you looked, you did find this sort of plastic contamination. The other thing that we were really surprised by was that almost all of the particles we found were fibers. So it was almost completely dominated by these sort of clothing or other sort of fibrous particles. And there weren't that many fragments or beads, or they found a few pieces of floss that they left on my desk, which I don't recommend doing. But in general, like in all of these locations, she found well over 1,000 pieces of plastic per kilogram of sediment. There's a range of rainbow colors. And we did some quality assurance testing with blank samples to make sure that we weren't actually contaminating our samples. And so as you move downstream, you can also see as you move downstream from location 1 to location 5 that the number of plastic particles or the concentration of plastics in the sediments does increase as you're moving downstream, which makes sense because you're encountering more sources of potential plastic and the river is flowing things downward. So it will accumulate as you move towards your river outlet. Just some photos of plastic particles she found. We weren't quite sure what A is. We don't know if it's a nurdle or some like sandblasting particle or anything like that. But as you can see, most of these are fibers. And then another student, James Davison, also same year, same program. He went down the River Derwent in the Lake District. And I have to admit, I kind of really wish I was helping him out with his field sampling because it is such a pretty area. So once again, he was doing a general water quality survey along that river as well. And similarly, he found microplastics in almost every piece of sediment he took and water sample. And once again, they were almost all fibers that he found. And similarly, as you move downstream, he found an increasing concentration of microplastic particles as you move from basically upstream all the way down to almost the river outlet. And so they were all fibers. So he found like I think a bag a farmer left in the river, or someone left in the river anyways, and you can very clearly see that it was weathering and sort of shedding these fibers that's ending up into the river. And they're flowing downstream and sort of accumulating in the sediment. And you can also always usually visually see some pieces in the sediment bits that you dig up as well. The very, very final bit that I was going to quickly mention was that another student, so she was an undergraduate student that just finished, also did a really great job, but because of the undergraduates are a little more limited with their time, this was a bit more of a limited survey. So she was looking specifically for tire particles in the water of Leith. And I'm very proud of myself that I remembered to spell tire using the British spelling with this one. So she did a smaller survey along the river of Leith looking at tire particles. These are much harder to identify without chemical analysis. But she did, once again, she found tire particles in almost, or what we think are tire particles in almost every single sample that we took. And similarly, the number increases as you move from, I think she started in Dean Village and went down towards sort of Leith proper. And so that the concentration increased significantly as you move towards Leith in Edinburgh. So I guess, I'm hoping to keep doing some more of these. I really want to slowly build a database of water quality of microplastics in rivers around the UK or even abroad if someone's willing to do it. So basically we found microplastics in every single sample we looked at. It's almost a guaranteed. If we dig up river sediment or sample river water somewhere, we're going to find microplastics in it. The water in the water, the concentration was usually around 100 particles per liter. The sediment concentration was usually over 1,000 particles per kilogram. The concentration increased as we moved downstream in all cases. And the fibers were the most dominant particle found in Esk and Derwent. And Daphne found tire particles to be the most dominant in the water of Leith. And we think that's because it's a much more heavily urbanized area. And so there's a lot more like tire wear and tear, and you're really close to sort of these big roads and urban centers there. And so these were only the particles that we could see. So we didn't try going down to sort of that like sub-micron nanometer scale, although I would like to at some point in the future. So that, I guess, to end on sort of a what do we need to know? The first bit is the good news. Literature suggests that our drinking water systems are doing their job and they're keeping the microplastics out of the drinking water. Either they just don't detect them fairly often, which if you think about how often I found microplastics in the river water is fantastic, or they find very, very low numbers of them. We need to develop a better understanding of where these microplastics are coming from and where they're going. So start doing sort of like an almost region-specific quantitative analysis of these microplastic flows. And then current assumption is everything right now ends up in the ocean, and I very strongly disagree with that. And we need to do a better job understanding how microplastics are actually moving through the environment to predict risk to humans and ecosystems. Do they just go with the flow? Do they transform? Do they accumulate? Do they release? What happens to them as they're doing this movement, as they're traveling along these pathways, and then start using this information to prevent releases. And that's going to be the most effective way of doing it. And then, such as designing better wastewater treatment systems, keeping microplastics from ending up in our soils. And one of the challenges here is that based on sort of decades of understanding of dealing with sort of soil and groundwater contamination, that the diffuse pollution of the plastic particles that are already in the environment is going to be really hard to remove. Like it's oftentimes, if you have a contaminated site that has a really high concentration, that's worthwhile cleaning up because all the contaminants concentrated in one spot. But when you have this low level contamination that's kind of spread out over the entire world, it's going to be much harder to fix. But humans are nothing if not ingenious. So I wouldn't count this one out just yet. People are working hard on the problem, and I'm sure we'll come up with something. And so that takes us to the end of the talk. I thought that might just be a good sort of introduction to talk a little bit about it, and then open the floor up for any questions people might have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ian. That was brilliant. I only knew it. I confess I knew a little bit, but I think I know a lot more now, and really wide-ranging questions, concerns, and thoughts. And I think we might have a few questions in the chat. And if not, we've got a few that the committee has put together for you. So we might just start off with one or two of those.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Yeah, we'll see if I can. We'll see if I can answer them.
Well, let's see. So, you talked about how microplastics or plastics, break down into microplastics and get into the environment. And you talked about the sizes. So the sources, we talked a little bit about plastic bottles and plastic being everywhere. You found mostly fibers, right?
Yeah.
In your sediments. Do you think that's indicative, or that means that fibers are the largest class of microplastics? Or are we just not seeing the others?
So if I had to wager, I'd guess that nanoplastics, at least by number, are the largest class of contaminants. But because they're so small, you can't count them. Like they're almost impossible to detect. But so most people are finding fibers in things like sediments and that, but maybe that's just because like by the nature of their shape and size, right? They're really long and really narrow. So they'll tend to get filtered out by river sediments. And so they'll get stuck on things, and so they'll accumulate a little more easily. So either they're the most common microplastic, or they're just the one that's easiest to find, because they're the one that just happens to get stuck on the things that we sample. And so I think.
Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry.
You said that the one in the Derwent that sampling program found that there was actually just a plastic bag upstream.
Yeah.
So do you? I mean, it's hard to say. Do you think that's a common thing, that because you see plastic bags and everything in streams all the time? Are those really the sources of the? So
I mean, in that case, that was a really remote area that was pretty far away from a lot of like wastewater treatment outflows and things like that. And so that's probably, so stuff like that probably is a pretty major source of those contaminants. Because I mean, the mass of the plastic probably isn't that big, coming off of that bag over time. But because the particles are really small, there's going to be a large number of particles coming off of it. And so you'll see things like that in the ocean as well, like a lot of fishing nets. Like I think a lot of plastic in the ocean comes from fishing nets over time. And as those break down, those will break down into fibers as well. Whether it's, I think that the common assumption is that it's usually from our clothes, that are breaking down as we wash them. And that's probably a big source of it. But whether that's the biggest or from these sort of, he had a British name for that bag the farmers left behind. And one of the challenges I've had moving here is that I don't know the names of any of these things, even though I thought we spoke the same language. But so whether it's these like farming and fishing things that are contributing most of the like geotextiles that are contributing most of the plastic particles, or whether it's our clothing, I'm not sure. My gut instinct is that it's probably like our clothing is my gut instinct, but I think there's oceanographers in that I think are working much more on trying to quantify that, and I'm not as familiar with their work.
And so these fibers are easily airborne, right? So do you think that's the first, like, I mean, certainly when you wash your clothes and it comes off in the washing machine and that goes and carries on into the wastewater, but are there other sources that are sort of the airborne is the mechanism?
So any like all of that dust that's building up in our houses, I need to dust in here. Like a lot of that's going to be from the breakdown of plastics and things like that. And so, or like all the tire particles coming off the road behind me as they jam on their gas pedal and hit the brakes and everything like that. Like a lot of that's going to be airborne as well, coming from cities, right? Because of like that mechanism, how they're generating gives it enough energy to already be airborne. Whereas it settles down as dust, and then the windy Edinburgh kind of whips everything up.
Right. No, that makes sense. One of our committee members had Katrina had an interesting, she just had written or read a story about microplastics impacting corals. And I think, what was that question that you had, Katrina, about, do you want to unmute yourself quickly? Maybe you can, or can I have to unmute you, right? No, Katrina should be able to. Sorry. Let me think about this for just a second.
Oh, I hit the ask to unmute button.
Yeah, that's okay. If I can find her in the list. Oh, there you are. Are you there?
Thanks, Maureen. Yep, I'm here now.
Yeah.
Ian, thanks for that talk. That was really interesting. And forgive me, I'm not sure on the detail of this, but I think I read that sunscreens were damaging coral because of the particles in them or a chemical in them. So perhaps not microparticles, I'm not sure. And then I think I read the other day that some coral reefs that have algae within them are somehow limiting the damage from the sunscreen particles. So again, maybe it's not relevant, but I wonder if that's something you're aware of and if you've any thoughts on that. Thank you.
So sunscreen came up a lot in my work on nanotechnology. So if you take a look at, I don't know how common sunscreen is here in Scotland. I don't think I've used it yet, but it's so if you take a look at the ingredient on your sunscreen bottle, there's a good chance it's going to say titanium dioxide. Or there's another one you can get that's also an organic compound, and I'm less sure about the organic compound, but I know so that titanium dioxide, that's a nanomaterial, so it'll be on less than 100 nanometers in diameter usually, anyways. And so that's really useful because it's an incredibly strong UV absorber, this sort of titanium dioxide. But the problem is, because it's such a tiny particle, as you move to smaller and smaller particle sizes, you get more surface area per mass of particles. So even though there's probably not that much mass of titanium in there, it's going to have an incredibly high surface area of like 100 meters per gram of particle. And so that property makes it really reactive, and its size makes it really easy to be able to enter into different organisms. And so, yeah, I can absolutely see those sunscreens as they're building up in sort of those like shallow, bathing waters and swimming waters, as they're, building up in there, would be entering into corals, because, we talk about right, because like living bodies are porous mediums, right? Like our skin has pores, and that's where we get acne and things like that, or where our sweat comes from. And just the same way that soil has pores, or our blood vessel has pores, like the corals are going to have pores as well, and that's how they're going to take in nutrients and water and all of that. And so, yeah, those particles, those titanium dioxide particles would be small enough to enter the coral, and it would be a big issue. Hadn't actually really thought about that in terms of corals, especially because they're already threatened. But yeah, that would be I think a serious issue. Did that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
I'll speak for you. I
There we go.
should give thumbs up.
Thumbs
yeah.
up.
Awesome. So Ruth Meyer has put a question in the chat, and I don't know, Ian, if you can see it. If not, I can read it out to you. I'll read it out to everybody. Microplastics seem to be very much in the media, but I feel mostly just to where these aren't good for us in the environment rather than specific. So they're just general, oh, they're not good.
Yeah.
Where is the most of the research focused, e.g. on how they're impacting our bodies, how they're getting into our bodies, the impact on the ocean or elsewhere? So right now, where do you think the biggest research focus is?
So I guess the good news is that there's a huge amount of research being done on almost every aspect related to microplastics, because it's currently sort of the trendy or sexy topic in science, which is actually really good because it means we're studying this from almost every possible angle. So there's a huge amount of people doing work on sort of the medical side of things, because linking exposure to health impacts isn't straightforward. I mean, anyone who's done work with like groundwater contaminants knows how hard it is to be able to call something like a carcinogen. So I think even all these old chlorinated solvents that we've been wrestling with since the 50s are still labeled, I think, as probable carcinogens. Because it's so hard to prove. So there's a huge amount of people, looking at these health effects and looking, can we see them in different cells and things like that. So there's a lot of work being done on that. So I would say probably the medical side, there's a lot of work being done right now on that. And also probably the next biggest one, or maybe even the biggest one, is looking at marine microplastics. So looking at microplastics in the ocean. Because that's, I think, really where most of this work started, is taking a look at ocean plastics. And then they started looking more into it, and they started finding more and more of these smaller particles. And the more they looked at these smaller particles, the more they found them everywhere. And so that's, I think, probably ocean plastics, looking at, how are they getting into fish? How are they getting into the oceans? Where are they being carried in the oceans? How are they cycling through the different layers? Are they in the Arctic Ocean? Like, what oceans are they in? So there's a huge amount of work being done on that. I would probably say that's the biggest one. And we're just starting to look at it in groundwater. So there's only been a couple of papers posted on this in the last couple of years. Soil science is probably a little bit ahead. So there's a little bit of work being done on soils as well. Is it getting into the roots of the plants and everything we eat? But yeah, I would say oceans are probably the biggest one. Oceans and the medical side of things.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for that. Also, there was an article I saw last year or so out in the Pacific Northwest in the US about impacts from tire contaminants. I forget what the chemical was, but it was going through stormwater and then into streams and impacting local salmon populations. There was a big thing about how those, I forget the chemical that was in the tire. It was actually,
Yeah, because I was just going through some of that. I was going through some of that with Daphne, and there's all the it's not just sometimes the plastic, right? It's not just the polyethylene molecule or even the contaminants that's picked up along the way. There's all these other additives that we'll add in to give it certain properties. Like I remember there was that big bisphenol A sort of worry a while, I was gonna say a couple of years ago. I think it was like over a decade ago. In drinking water bottles, and I kind of forget what's happened with that. I think they phased it out, but yeah, a lot of times those additives can be more toxic than the actual plastic itself, I think.
And that kind of gets back to what you were saying before about the little illustration of the Tupperware container, right? That it was the chemicals that are adsorbed or adhered onto the plastic particles that also can be a problem.
Yeah, and so those will slowly leach out, like all those additives will slowly leach out into the water over time. Because a lot of the times, like some of that stuff is can't think of the word for it right now, almost like a trade secret or something. Like people don't exactly publish the list of everything they put into their plastics, and that can make that really hard to figure out.
Right. Yeah, I did see when I was looking around the internet yesterday that there was an article and I forget the name of the investigators, there's somebody who was actually looking at microplastics in groundwater in Australia. I can look that up and
Yeah, there were a couple of papers that came out of there. They were looking at an unconfined aquifer. So there's no confining layer on the top, so it's just open to like sand and air. So basically, those are the easiest bits of water to get into, or groundwater to access, but they're the most open to contamination. Yeah, I think there are a couple of researchers were finding microplastics in groundwater down in Australia. I think it was close to a landfill. I think if we're talking about the same.
Yeah, okay, that would be it. Yeah, because it's almost, and this is not microplastics, but it's almost sort of the same pathway that you'd have from asbestos fibers, right?
Yeah.
With asbestos fibers getting into drinking water, because it's a concern. But from what I know, and you probably know more than I do, is that it's not so much ingestion, so it's not much drinking the water that has asbestos fibers in it, but if you inhale those fibers from like water that has them in it, like in a shower or something where there's water, the fibers come in and you inhale that, that's where you can have a problem with their lungs, like the asbestos, whatever it is.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of contaminants that have a similar, like physical profile to asbestos. Obviously, so asbestos is the famous one. A lot of these fibers, right, they're going to be, they're long and thin, kind of just like asbestos. Carbon nanotubes people are looking into, right, because we use it in all of our sporting goods. It looks identical to asbestos. I mean, it's not asbestos, but it has a similar shape profile to it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, if we drink it, is one, drinking might be one of the safest ways to be exposed to it. But yeah, when you're in the shower, because that hot water has enough energy to volatilize things, and yeah, you breathe it in, it can get into your lungs and probably irritate it.
Yep. Yep. No, thanks. I'm going to look over here to my question list to see what else I've missed. Let's see here. So back to your ending point was, we're looking at it and more, we're trying to understand it. What can we do now to limit the amount of microplastics in the environment, do you reckon?
I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, right? It's so I mean, I would start by trying to reduce your own personal exposure to it. I mean, one of the, we moved away from having plastic tea kettles and all of that. Is unfortunately the solutions are more expensive. Like on a personal level, the solutions are, to be environmentally friendly and health conscious are always more expensive, which is frustrating. But yes, we've moved away from using those plastic sponges, although I still use them occasionally, to more like those natural fibers. They don't clean as well though, which is kind of annoying. I mean, I would say, like a lot of it, I think is going to have to be on the regulatory side of things, right? So like, how can you convince the regulators to start paying attention to it? And they are paying attention to it. We've had a lot of interest from SEPA, for instance, here in the UK, in pushing forward some of this work in our drinking water quality regulator, and understanding where this is coming from. And they are doing a lot of work, taking a look at microplastics in our drinking water system. But yeah, I think we have to figure out where they're coming from first, and whether that involves figuring out a way to remove it from the sludge before we put it on farm fields, or changing how we use that, or anything like that. I think we're going to have to start rethinking. Well, the easiest way to do it is to start with the wastewater treatment plant, because we know that's where a huge amount of them come from, and they're point sources, so they're easy to deal with.
Right.
But other ones might be like separating out our combined stormwater and sewage systems. In a lot of cities like Edinburgh and my home city of London, Ontario, we have this combined stormwater sewage system. So every time there's a big rainstorm, the sewage system overflows and it dumps into a river. One, which is really gross, and two, right, you end up with a huge amount of microplastics that then just flow into the river. And so one way to do it might be to start separating those out, or come up with different solutions for that.
Yeah,
because
it's not like you can filter it either, right? I mean, it would just be so impracticable.
Yeah, it would. I think the filter would clog up pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah.
Just like the lint filter on the back of the back of everyone's dryer, they always forget to clean.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good. Two other questions. One is just a real quick comment that when I was in New Zealand, there was a big promotion for plastic-free July, and I don't know, maybe it's a Kiwi thing, but it was just a lot of, a month free of not buying plastic, of not using plastic. And they mentioned the same thing you said before about they had a list of brand names of tea bags that did or did not have plastics in the tea bag.
Yeah.
I thought was a pretty interesting thing. I didn't know if you'd heard anything similar in Scotland yet about that.
I haven't actually heard about that. That's really interesting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed when I moved here, and although this might just be me thinking about this with rose-colored goggles, was how much like everything here, like all of our groceries, like all of our produce here, at least in Scotland or in the Sainsbury's I go to, was all individually wrapped in plastic. Right, like all of your carrots are wrapped in plastic. All your broccoli is wrapped in plastic. All the cucumbers and everything is all wrapped in plastic. Yes, and I think there is I know that Sainsbury's has taken away a lot of their wrapping, which I have to admit I was hypocritical and kind of grumbled about it because I had a bunch of loose carrots rattling around in my backpack.
Right.
Yeah, so I think there is a campaign, and I think Canada recently tried to promote or is thinking about getting rid of phasing out single-use plastics in a lot of consumer goods as well. So it is something that's getting on more people's radar. And honestly, I think, yeah, getting rid of those single-use plastics is probably going to be one of our best ways of avoiding it, or switching to, compostable materials like cellulose and things like that.
Right. Yeah. Katrina just put in the chat that she thought it was in June. There was a campaign for avoid single-use plastics in June. So
I'll have to pay attention to that, Katrina.
Yeah, that's right. It's coming up. We're just timely here to start thinking about that for next month because it's a thing. It's good. And you said something before about when you moved to Edinburgh that was one of the things that surprised you or made you think about, plastic use.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that in your move, because you from Canada to Edinburgh, that was unexpected or something that you didn't think was going to be a thing, and it was?
Now that I've been here for almost 3 years now, so I'm gonna have to. So I think
it could be science or not. It can be really broad, right?
Yeah, no. So it's often the small things that I guess trip you up a little bit. Like it's easy to roll with the big differences because you expect the big differences, but it's like the small things. Like it's usually like I think so in Canada, the ground floor, we would the floor you walk in on, that's at the ground, we would say that's the first floor. The next floor up is the second floor, third floor. And so I was trying to call in a noise complaint for the people above us, and I had a very confusing conversation with the police officer because we couldn't figure out what floor I was. Anyways, it was really, so there's just some of those small language differences were the biggest ones. Because the simple ones tend to be the easiest to work with. But I do, even though talking about more plastics here, this city, like Edinburgh, is so much more walkable than any city I've been to in North America. Like I know everyone here grumbles about the train service and the bus service and biking here, but it's so much better than it is in Canada. It's actually nice. We haven't owned a car in almost 3 years. And aside from using the occasional enterprise car club, it's actually really nice to not need a car to get around.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Anything else? Anybody? Let me think. What else? Survivors being a source. Any other questions that I've missed in the chat or on our list, committee members? Anything else? No, I think. Yep. So the take home from you, Ian, and thank you again for doing this.
Yeah.
It's been great. Take home is just to minimize your personal use and keep thinking about it, right?
So
watch this space.
I'd like to, can I add a point of optimism? Because environmentalism is often really doom and gloom, right? Like, you're reading through the news, it's, floods in Germany and climate change and plastics and all of, coral reefs and all that kind of stuff. It's often really depressing. And I have to admit, it's one of the things I struggle with that, right? Because, you think about this stuff day in and day out. But I think this is one of the first times in human history where we've actually been able to look at problems, like identify and find problems before they become these massive problems, right? So like if we were dealing with this much plastic, and climate change 100 years ago, we wouldn't have the technology or the money or the foresight or the science to be able to do any of the stuff that we're now doing. And we'd be up the proverbial creek. But so like we now have this, we have the capacity. We have these amazing machines that can detect plastics down to nanometer size. We have, we're able to do all this crazy stuff and develop technologies to help with climate change. And so this is one of the first times where we've actually been able to identify these problems and do it beforehand. And it's hard. I guess it's hard for you guys because you only see the depressing side of things. But like, there's a huge amount of work on technology behind the scenes at universities, looking at decarbonizing heating and decarbonizing electricity and energy storage and renewable technologies and actual biodegradable plastics and cleaning that up. Like there's some of the smartest people in the world are working on this, and it's actually really reassuring to see. To see and be able to work alongside them, and we do have a lot of environmental success. So because Maureen, you're a hydrogeologist, looking at groundwater contamination, that's probably been one of the biggest environmental success stories in history, where we had the river caught, we had lakes and rivers catching on fire. All right, and sort of like the finance system, like banks and regulators and industry and environmental hippies, everyone got together and solved the problem. So we can do it. We know we can do it, and so we have a model for doing it. So that groundwater contamination is a perfect model for solving problems like this. And so it's often doom and gloom, but there's a lot of hope, I would say, as well.
Yeah, I think absolutely the glass half full rather than the glass half empty kind of approach.